Hello, everyone. Welcome to our show where we speak with industry leaders on how they set and achieve moonshot goals. I'm Abhinav, co-founder of Peoplebox, your OKR and performance platform, and I'm excited to welcome Austin Strong to our show. Austin is the Director of Strategy at Weave, an all-in-one communication platform listed on New York Stock Exchange. He's an engineer who found his way into the world of strategy, consulting, and operations. He's also a tireless crusader of OKRs, an expert in strategy execution space. Austin, welcome to the show. Why don't we start with telling our audience a bit about Weave Communication and your role in it?
Yeah, absolutely. So Weave is essentially what we like to call a smartphone for small business. What Weave does is we provide a phone system that's connected with software that makes it extremely easy for small business owners, particularly in the healthcare space, to communicate with their patient base. So we've actually started back in 2011. Our founder, Brandon Rodman, his mother was a front office receptionist at a dental office, and he realized there was a vast need for software to make her job easier. And so Weave was actually the first company from Utah to be accepted into Y Combinator. Since then has grown dramatically. We went public in November of 2021. And now we serve not just dental customers, but optometrists, veterinarians, physical therapists, medical spas, and a wide variety of other verticals. And really what our platform does is if you ever walk into, for example, a dental office and you see them pick up the phone, it allows them to do things like recognize your names, see how much is on your balance, schedule appointments, collect payments, all the jobs that a dentist does or any small healthcare business. We try to reduce that time and save them hours upon hours and really help small businesses communicate with their patient base.
Fantastic. And would you like to tell our audience a little bit about your role at Weave?
Yeah, so I am the Director of Strategy at Weave. And so strategy is one of those terms. When I tell people I work in strategy, I've realized strategy is very much a cliche or sometimes a buzzword. No one really knows what it means. And so at Weave, what that really, what my team does is four things in particular. So first is we lead all strategic planning cycles at the company. So for example, what is our company's focus, objectives, KPIs, OKRs going to be for 2023? And then we also help leadership do the long-term strategic planning. How does Weave want to position itself against its competitors? What new markets do we want to grow into in the future? How does our product need to evolve? All of that fits underneath what I would call our strategic planning umbrella. Our next umbrella is new markets and growth. And so any new industries that we want to enter, for example, we've started in the dental industry, but when we made the decision to go into veterinarian, my team was the one who led all the analysis, was really the point of the spear in saying, this is the market that we should go after next, understanding the customers and aligning all the company departments to launch into that new vertical. And we'll do the same thing for international markets as well. So when Weave expands into places like Canada or Australia, we're the point of the spear in those growth efforts. So the third bucket is one I generously call BizOps. Our company doesn't have a separate business operations team. And so that's really subdivided into being the internal management consultants, as well as the chief of staff to the CEO. And that involves things like running internal consulting engagements, like our CEO will call us in and say, hey, can you guys go spend a deep dive for 2 weeks in understanding why sales in optometry are flagging? And then we'll come back with a root cause, present recommendations, and align the company to fixing the problem. And then we'll also run large company meetings like our quarterly business reviews or company kickoffs, weekly OKR trackings, et cetera. And then the last thing we'll do is M&A. We don't have a separate corporate development group here at Weave, so my team will also do due diligence on any potential target acquisitions. So again, those four buckets of strategic planning, new markets, business operations, and M&A, that's my strategy role at Weave, is to help lead those efforts.
Fantastic, Austin. And what an amazing journey it has been. As a fellow YC company, I can very clearly say that it's one company that we really look up to, and it would not have been possible without an amazing strategy as well as an amazing strategy execution. So let's talk a little bit about that. Strategy execution. These are crazy times. While layoffs are happening everywhere, most leaders still want to achieve moonshot goals, but have less resources now. Does it mean companies need to calibrate their strategy and tone down their goals?
That's a really good question. I actually disagree with the idea of tapering down moonshot goals. Now, do we need to sometimes scale back growth projections or revenue projections, especially during something like a recession? Potentially. But what I find more is that turbulent economic times aren't really necessary to limit our moonshot goals. Rather, it means that the path towards our goals is what needs to change. So for example, you as a company may have a goal to reach 30% year-over-year revenue growth. And pre-economic recession, you may have been planning to do that via your traditional go-to-market engine with your sales and your marketing. But now you may be forced to achieve the same 30%, but via a different path. So for example, instead of using your traditional sales and marketing methods, you might instead need to come up with a new product line that is product-led growth. It's self-sign-up, it's self-onboarding with a much lower cost of delivery. That's a very different motion to getting towards your revenue growth, but it doesn't mean that the destination should change, but simply the path towards it. Just another example is you may have that 30% year-over-year growth and recognize that we're in a recession, and these represent opportunities as much as they represent resistance. And so, for example, if you're a company in a position with a high amount of capital where you have raised recently via an IPO or another series round of funding, there might be a lot of opportunities to accelerate that revenue growth via acquisition of companies who are struggling for capital. So again, I don't believe that the moonshot goal should necessarily change, but we need to say our path towards that probably needs to be altered. And I think that generally represents the better long-term option. And as a last resort, it may mean going back to your annual operating plan, your financial model, and tapering down those goals. But I would do that only after you've exhausted all the alternative paths.
Makes sense about finding the right opportunities, and especially in this tough time. And I'm sure if you look hard, there are plenty of that. Austin, you mentioned Weave also went public just over a year ago. So did your approach to strategy execution has changed at all after going public?
The thing that going public does is for anyone who's never worked in a public company, it really shines a spotlight on your operations because you're essentially opening yourself up to the world, and it's no longer just a discussion between you and your board and your employees, but now you have analysts and investors and public shareholders who are interested and wondering how you're spending your time and your resources. So really what it did for our strategy is it forced us to really sharpen our pencils. And if anything, we had to become much more mature and sophisticated in how we did OKRs, in how we, what our long-term plans were, and actually having a written document and written metrics, because now we realized that was going to be something that we would have to essentially be accountable for every quarter during an investor call and the board calls leading up to that. And so rather than going away from a strategy, I would say we've become much more sophisticated since November, as opposed to before where frankly, we're just trying to grow as quickly as we can and get things ready. And so it's been it's definitely a jarring process to go public, but it's also a really, really good accelerant for becoming the kind of company that deserves to be on the New York Stock Exchange.
Fantastic. And also you are now a large company. So our audience is very curious to know that how do you ensure that you're able to align all your teams and individuals and execute fast, just like a small startup?
So that's a really good question. And I would say a couple things that have helped us with that. So the first is being a large company, we've realized you need to have a dedicated team that actually owns the strategy and actually owns the OKRs. So in the case of Weave, that's my team, it's the corporate strategy team. I've seen instances in smaller cases where it might be the CEO or even their chief of staff, but someone has to actually be tasked that this is designated as their job. And it's well understood that This is the person that owns the document. They own the metrics. They're going to be the ones evangelizing. There's a favorite saying of mine, and it's a little bit on the nose, but it says, if you want a dog to starve, ask several people to feed it. And so unless you designate a single person to be in charge of the strategy and the metrics associated with it, you end up with a situation where no one actually owns it. No one takes care of it. So defining ownership for me is one of the critical things that we've done. The second thing is you actually have to have a written plan. You'd be amazed at how many companies don't actually have a strategy plan written down. Prior to coming to Weave, I worked in consulting, and we would see this all the time. We'd ask for a strategy plan, and people would say, well, we can talk about it, but there's actually not a documentation of it anywhere. And the problem, if it's not documented, if you don't have a single place that your CEO down to your staff level employees can look at it, you don't really have a plan, because when it's written, it forces you to grapple with the actual questions. It forces you to debate it. And so when it's not on paper, it's not real. The other advantage of having an actual written plan is it allows you to make sure that every single person at the company is unified on what the strategy actually is. So at Weave, for example, we have a simplified version of our plan that we call Strategy on a Page. And it's one of the very first documents that every employee at the company will receive in 2023 when they join. They'll have an electronic version. You'll find copies of it in our conference rooms. And the reason that does it, that's important, is because it allows every employee, no matter what their role is, if they're in product, if they're in support, if they're in engineering, if they're in sales, they can say, I understand what the company is trying to achieve and how they're trying to do this. And that then, even though I may not contribute to every single part of this plan, I can identify what I or my team, what parts of the plan we can make a contribution to. And we found that that's very important for essentially democratizing strategy implementation and execution. If you think of like a military analogy, you have a general who has this large battle plan, but you need to have each army, it doesn't move as a single organism. It's composed of individual regiments or divisions. And if those divisions understand what the overall strategy is, it allows them to act autonomously and come up with their own innovations so that the general can speed up, execution, decision-making, creativity, but also ensure that you don't have a division that's going to go rogue and do something different than what the overall battle strategy dictates. So if your people don't have a written plan and they don't know it, you're going to have chaos, people going in 1,000 different directions. But if everyone knows it, then you've basically outsourced your brain power, and you've empowered each team to contribute towards the same goal in their own way. And that really drives powerful execution. So I've talked about dedicated owners. I've talked about, making sure it's a written plan that everyone knows. One other thing that's important, and this is probably where Peoplebox comes in, you need to have a centralized tool to track all of this information. If you think about it, like a strategy plan is going to involve a lot of initiatives. It's going to have a lot of metrics. At we've got 4 key focus areas. Each of those focus area has about 3 to 5 objectives. Each of those objectives has a KPIs associated with it. Each of those has key results. And you can imagine as you multiply that out, you're quickly looking at something with 100+ very important items to maintain. And if you're simply trying to do that out of, a notepad, it becomes very, very overwhelming. So you need to have either a tool like Peoplebox or an internal tool that allows you to manage all of this information in a very digestible way. Otherwise, people tend to give up on it. And then finally, I'll say the last thing you have to do is you need constant communication. So you need to make sure that, again, the person who owns the strategy execution, that you've got at the leadership level meetings, you've got monthly meetings, quarterly meetings, newsletter updates, that it's not something that you just like talk about once in a blue moon, right before the investor call. It has to be constant throughout. So that's a lot. But again, I really think like those are 4 pillars that we found here at Weave that make an enormous difference in operating as a large company.
I love that quote. If you want a dog to starve, ask everyone to feed it. So dedicated strategy team, a written plan, a communication, and OKRs. And since you brought it up, let's talk about OKRs at Weave. So very curious to know, when did you start using OKRs and why?
So we started using OKRs shortly before we started developing our plan for right now in August of last year. And so people don't realize it takes a long time to get the right OKRs. It's not something you just like throw up on the wall. There's a lot of thought that goes into these. And these have always existed in some form before Weave. So I've been at Weave for about 18 months, and they existed in a primitive form, I would say, at that point. But when we realized for 2023, now that we're public, we had to identify what defines a successful 2023 year for us. And so we went through a very rigorous process of defining those objectives, defining what I would call the KPIs or the child metrics that would support those goals, and then the list of key initiatives that actually go into that. Now, one of the hardest things with OKRs that we found is, again, you have to have someone that owns it. So in that case, that was dedicated to me and my team. The other thing that we often see people making mistakes with an OKRs is you have to start small. People often don't want to accept the reality of trade-offs. And so despite like the fact that we want to do everything, we actually can't do everything at once. And because if you don't make the decision, what are we going to do first? And by definition, we are not going to do these other things, your OKRs are going to sprawl. And that's often where I see companies in their strategy execution really struggle with these, is OKRs quickly, because no one is willing to say no to an idea or no to an objective, it becomes an unmanageable mess. And so the complexity leads to the exhaustion and the abandonment of OKRs. But if you start smaller with a focus on maybe 2 or 3, you're going to increase your odds of success. If you are refusing to say no and you have 12 OKRs and that quickly multiplies out, you and your team are going to get burned out, and people begin to say OKRs aren't effective or they don't work, which really isn't true. It's the fact that you have refused to grapple with saying no and embracing the reality of trade-offs.
Amazing. So have someone own it, start small. And, one struggle we hear very often from companies is about tying OKRs to individual performance. I'm curious about the degree to which you link company strategy with individual performance and engagement, or you think that how it should be linked.
Yeah, this is something that we're trying to get better at here at Weave. But again, this is going to go back to the point of having a written strategy plan. If you have a plan that everyone agrees on, and it's clear that how your team is going to map to one or more of the key focus areas in that plan, each individual department and then the teams within that department can essentially create what I would call a cascade model of, this is specifically what we are going to do to contribute to the company's objectives. And you can actually get that down to the individual level. And if you do that properly, that should become really one of the key metrics at a year-end performance review of, hey, here are the 3 things that you were supposed to do in your specific role to contribute to the company's strategy. We're going to talk about what contribution you made, and that's going to be a significant factor in your year-end performance review and your evaluation of whether you're getting the promotion or whether you need some coaching.
Amazing. And talk to me about visibility, Austin. How do you handle the whole culture of full visibility and transparency? Do everybody have access to OKRs in the company, even the intern and early employees, or is it only sort of shown or accessed by selected team? And how do you aim to build that whole visibility, cross-functional visibility and transparency in the company?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And this is one that I think is tricky, because a fully baked strategy plan is going to contain some sensitive information that you don't want disclosed to the public. You don't want your competitors getting a hold of exactly what metrics you're trying to achieve or how you're going to achieve them. And so you have to strike a balance between really the solution that we've come up with Weave is we have a very detailed strategy plan, and that has all the numbers, it has all the metrics, and there is a limited number of folks who have access to that. And that's traditionally our C team, our vice presidents, and our directors. But we want everyone at the company to know in general what we're doing, so they're not spending their time and efforts in the wrong areas. And so that's why we created what we call strategy on a page, which is essentially, it's the same information, but without some of like the the sensitive metrics and financial data or exact tactics, but it is a simplified version that still points you in the right direction without revealing as much sensitive information. And that is something that we give to every employee at the company. And so even though they may not know the exact number behind the goal or the exact agreements and plans, they have got a good sense of what the overall motion is, and that allows them to row in the same direction where the leadership has the fully detailed plan. And so that's something that our team manages, is having those, again, the detailed and the simplified version. And that's how we kind of manage the balance between sensitive information and making sure everyone has what they need.
Makes sense. I would say completely makes sense. And Austin, our audience include a lot of CXOs. And when I speak with them, one struggle I hear consistently is, we want to use OKRs in our company, but who should own OKRs? You also mentioned that having a team own that is very important. The question is who? So in your experience, who's the best person or team to own OKRs in a medium to large company?
That's a great question. I would say in a very small company, OKR should be owned by the CEO and the chief of staff. In a medium to large company, as it scales, they're going to get pulled into other responsibilities. And so at that point, I think it makes sense to have the chief operating officer, and if they have a biz ops team report to them or a corporate strategy team, you want that's an ideal group to manage the ownership of the OKRs. What's key though is it needs to be the CEO or the chief operating officer, because someone actually has to hold the entire organization accountable to the objectives and the key results. And in my experience, if you outsource that to any other function, it tends to be too departmentalized, whereas a CEO and the chief operating officer, their teams are broad across the entire organization, are generally best suited to manage those because they have their job is to think of the company holistically.
Awesome. Let's shift our gears to the tough times. With limited resources now, which means less budget available and less people, high productivity is going to be a critical factor to achieve moonshot goals. Austin, you have been a consultant and an executive. What has really worked for you in increasing team productivity?
So one of the things, two things. One is simplification. And I mentioned this earlier. One of the hardest things about executing is if you spread yourself thin across too many fronts, you're trying to do too many things at once, it becomes very, very difficult to execute. And so the idea is less but better. So look at all your objectives and again, grapple with the trade-off and say, if we could only do one of these things, maybe two of these things, what would we pick? And then you just need to say, we are going to do those. We're going to table everything else, and we're going to fanatically focus on doing these one or two things very, very well. The second thing that I found with execution is communication, especially as you get large as an organization, becomes like the lubricant between the gears of a big machine. And so at Weave, for example, we've tried to build in constant channels for communication on execution and strategy towards the OKRs. So we have a meeting that we call Vital Signs that we do every week that involves our C-team, VP and director level leadership, where we're reviewing the key metrics at the business about how we're pacing. We have our strategy plan, we have our 4 focus areas, and we have a C-team member that is the owner or the focus area lead for all of the OKRs associated with that. They do a couple things. They report to the C-team weekly on the progress. They hold a monthly meeting with all of the project owners in their area. And then monthly, as a part of an extended Vital Signs meeting, they update everyone on the overall progress towards the objectives. We have that same cadence built into our quarterly business reviews. And then we also have that built into our annual company kickoff. And so what we've essentially done is established a weekly, monthly, quarterly, and a yearly cadence where we are talking about the strategy. Because if it's something that we only talk about as part of our quarterly, business reviews or our quarterly investor relations, there's so much momentum you can lose. And so it becomes something that we have to talk about every single week.
Amazing. Austin, I just love about this cadence of weekly, monthly, and the quarterly business review, especially the vital sign meeting. I'm very curious to know, how do you ensure that you don't take your eyes off OKRs in all these meetings? Are OKRs discussed in every meeting or in just some of them?
So again, all those meetings I just described, OKRs are literally the purpose of those meetings. And so vital signs is all about the metrics. The key project meetings are about the initiatives driving the OKRs. The metrics meeting that occurs monthly, that is about the monthly progress towards the OKRs. Quarterly business reviews is essentially our scorecard on our OKRs for the quarter. So OKRs are not an afterthought. It's not something that we tuck in the appendix. It's literally the front and center focus of the meeting. And anything else is taken offline about how are we supporting driving towards these goals.
I'm going to just write it down as a tagline, probably for our marketing campaign, which says OKR is not an afterthought, but the focus of all our review meetings. I just love that. Moving on, Austin, we see it very often that when companies are small, everyone is accountable to a number. People are chasing metrics. They are talking about outcomes. But this change as companies scale and people become more accountable to initiatives and tasks. Is that an issue you have also faced at Weave, and how did you address it?
Yeah, and that's one that I don't think we have a perfect solution for, to be candid, because when you're small, it's very easy to put a number over someone's head. When you're large, and in Weave's case, we have around 800 employees, it's very difficult to put a single number to everyone's head, especially if they don't exist in easily quantifiable roles like sales. And so what's more important that we found is to try to measure the overall output of the team. And then we have to, again, empower the teams to say, this is the number, or this is the goal that we want your team or department to achieve. And if you understand that well, we're going to entrust you at that level to decide how you want to measure the accountability of your individual team members. And again, that's something that needs to be, that's the beauty of, going back to my military analogy, empowering the division leaders instead of the general for determining how every single soldier in the army should be rated. If you can break it down so that the departments understand what they need to get done, it allows them to manage at that tactical level how you measure the overall performance of their individual components.
Absolutely. So just to paraphrase, if you can break it down from a department to the team, you would also be able to break it down from a team and individual, and will be able to somewhat make a team and an individual accountable. This completely makes sense. We are almost at the end of the show. So my last question, what is your number one advice that you want to give to other strategy leaders to ensure a very tight strategy execution in 2023?
So one thing that I would recommend is there's a concept that I call pre-wiring. And what that means is if you were to go, you may be a brilliant strategy leader and you may have this glorious vision of what your objectives and initiatives should be and your 5-year plan. And if you simply go to the CEO, slap that on their desk and say, hey, here's the plan, you may convince the CEO. But if you have not brought along every other leader in the company with you at that point, you may have the right answer, but if it's delivered the wrong way, those are the folks that you're going to rely on to actually execute the idea. And so if you haven't brought them along the journey with you, it's never going to get implemented. And in essence, you have a brilliant plan on paper, but no execution whatsoever. Right. And so pre-wiring to me means when you're building your strategy, it's more painful, it may be slower, but it's 100% worth the effort of meeting with all the key stakeholders in advance. Think about who actually has to implement this plan. Get and meet with them and say, hey, we're putting together the plan for the year. We're putting together the strategy. What do you think needs to be part of it? What changes would you make? How would you see this implementing? Make them feel like they're part of the process, even have them present it alongside of you. Because my experience is people will defend what they feel like they own. And so if you can do that, by the time you present that to the CEO, you've got every other executive in the room nodding their heads, because they have been a huge part of crafting that document that's now on his or her desk. And they're the ones that say, we had a part in this and we're ready to execute it. Build up that bottoms up momentum towards them rather than trying to be tops down dictatorial.
Absolutely. Bring everyone together. Well, there is no I in strategy, I just realized. So it makes sense. That's an incredible advice, Austin. Well, to that, we are at the end of our show. It's been great speaking with you, Austin. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our chat, and I'm sure our audience will too. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Abhinav. I appreciate the time.
Thanks a lot. Have a great day.